Counter-Narrative News delighted to bring another episode in the series on Walter Rodney. It'll also be included in the series on CLR James because of Walter Rodney's commentary on CLR in this. Of course, Walter Rodney and CLR James are giants in revolutionary Marxist anti-colonial theory and leadership. We are going to take two subheadings from the book that we have been serializing called Walter Rodney Speaks, published in 1990 by Africa World Press. It's the sections entitled The Significance of Eric Williams and CLR James on page 14, and then we'll skip to page 28, which is entitled Study Group with CLR James. Now, Eric Williams from Trinidad and Tobago published his seminal work, Capitalism and Slavery in 1944, really a massive contribution to understanding how the European colonial enslavement of African people and exploitation of their labour was an absolute central means by which British capitalism became such a leading force in the world. And of course, CLR James's incredible work on the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins, published in 1938, also a massive contribution and really filled the gaping, massive hole which was the absence of Marx and Engels. Failed to make any commentary on the Haitian Revolution, which is very interesting. And in another episode on Counter-Narrative News, there's a very interesting article that explores why it may have been the case that Marx and Engels failed to make any comments about that. So it has to be also mentioned that Eric Williams is the first Prime Minister of independent Trinidad and Tobago in 1962, but he holds different ministerial positions and he becomes the leader of Trinidad by the late 60s into the 70s, and he comes into conflict actually with Walter Rodney and other people in the revolutionary Black Power socialist movement, including in using the state to repress them and even imprison and kill people of this movement, which did leave Eric Williams to kind of be a bit defensive and try and posture like he was in support of the working classes conducting this struggle. But that's another complicated issue. But it is referenced here when Walter Rodney talks about Eric Williams becoming involved in other things, quote unquote. And there is a note which I'm going to mention before I go into actually quoting the text here on page 15. It says, CLR James returned to Trinidad in April 1958, and at the request of the People's National Movement, of which Eric Williams was in the leadership, he edited the party's weekly newspaper, The Nation, for 2 years. He was also secretary of the West Indian Federal Labour Party during the same period. He resigned both posts in 1960. For an account of James's political differences with the leadership of Dr. Eric Williams, see CLR James's Party Politics in West Indies. See also Ivor Oxall, Black Intellectuals Come to Power, and Selwyn D. Ryan, Race and Nationalism in Trinidad and Tobago, a study of decolonization in the multi-racial society. If one's not mistaken, and one recollects correctly, CLR James and also Eric Williams clashed over Eric Williams being willing to allow US imperialism to have a military presence on the island of Trinidad, but I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure that there was a schism around that issue. But to the quote at hand, and to quote, the significance of Eric Williams and CLR James. When we were studying at the university in Jamaica, CLR James's Black Jacobins and Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery were really two of the foremost texts that informed a nationalist consciousness. At that time, it wasn't very clear that the methodology and the ideology of these two works were significantly different from anything else that we were reading. What was clear was that here were people taking a perspective that appealed to us young West Indians. One must say this clearly in the case of Capitalism and Slavery, since we don't want to get confused by the fact that its author became involved in other things. We want to understand that the work is historically important, that Williams was making points about what slavery and capitalism were about, and these were both intellectually and emotionally appealing. One could recognize oneself in that history, one could feel with it, and this was certainly even more the case with the Black Jacobins, which was about black people involved in revolution, involved in making choices, involved in real movements of history, in which there were splits and some people fell by the wayside, but which also possessed a tremendous underlying strength and represented a real achievement. Later on, of course, I got to understand, especially as I started to sift through the historiography of the Haitian Revolution, how it was that certain conceptual tools, ideological tools, a Marxist methodology had informed James's work and was responsible in large part for raising its quality over and above that of several other attempted formulations on the revolution. James has exercised a sort of model image for many young West Indian progressives. Again, and even before one had fully come to terms with the question of Marxist ideology, he did stand out in the Trinidadian situation as the person who seemed to be making more sense than others. It was as simple as that. He seemed to be willing to go further. He seemed to be most complete in his acceptance of the necessity for the Trinidadian and ultimately the West Indian people to make a break with their past. And, of course, CLR James was known in Guyana. He was known to me just as a figure. One didn't know who he was, but one noticed the effect that CLR James had when he came into town, and maybe people will go to hear him because it would be a curiosity to go and hear somebody who was called a Marxist and was a well-known black figure. You may also have heard the word Trotskyite bandied about somewhere, so you really had to turn up to see who this creature was, this black man who was a Marxist and a Trotskyite and who apparently is saying some important things to which people have to listen. But later on, at the university in Jamaica, CLR James did exercise this force as a kind of model figure. And more recently, in my own life and thought, he's remained a model in a specific kind of way, not in the sense that I feel any commitment to pursue positions which he has adopted per se, but as he has grown older, and as I have looked around me and recognized how the struggle creates so many casualties, and somehow along the line physiology plays a part, and how the older people get the more they seem to opt out of any revolutionary struggle, seem to wane, seem to take up curious positions that are actually reversals of where they earlier stood. James has become a model of the possibilities of retaining one's intellectual and ideological integrity over a protracted period of time. In other words, I've always said to myself that I hoped that at his age, if I'm around, I still have some credibility as a progressive, that people wouldn't look around and say, this used to be a revolutionary. End of quote. Yeah, a little bit of a bittersweet moment there towards the end. Of course, Walter Rodney would not be around after 1980 to get old and to explore where his politics may have ended up. So to page 28, quote, study group with CLR James. So that was the period up until 1966 when I was grappling on my own with these ideas in the academic institution in which I found myself. I was, of course, relating to the odd Marxists outside, but generally speaking, the political climate in Britain, especially on the left, was not conducive to the development of any independent Marxist thought. There was nothing on the English political scene as such that was helpful. On the other hand, there was a study group experience which several of us had with CLR James and his wife Selma James. Getting together in London and meeting over a period of 2 to 3 years on a fairly regular basis afforded me the opportunity that I and a number of other people were seeking to acquire a knowledge of Marxism, a more precise understanding of the Russian Revolution, and of historical formulation. One of the most important things which I got out of that experience was a certain sense of historical analysis, in the sense that CLR James was really a master of the analysis of historical situations. It was not enough to study Lenin's State and Revolution. It was important to understand why it was written and what was going on in Russia at the precise point in time. It was not enough to study Lenin's What Is to Be Done. One must understand the specific contextual nature of the discussions that were going in Russia at the time. This comes to mind because I feel that a lot of the debates that go on about Marxism are definitely out of context. People pull from texts without knowing the history of those texts and the context of the debates in which they were located. One thing is certain about CLR James: he has mastered a whole range of his theory and historical data and analysis. This explains why he was very good at focusing in. The group might do some reading and try to understand what a text said, but James gave it that added dimension which nobody else in the group could easily acquire, in being able to say, this is what Lenin was about, this is what Trotsky was doing, he had just come from this conference or this debate, or this was his specific programmatic objective when he was writing, and so on. That was a very important experience which I'm still pondering. I see its significance more as one goes along, and I recognize the necessity for us to do much more work of that type. Of course, as many people know, CLR had the habit of really incisively dismissing bourgeois foolishness. And I think that his wife Selma James in her own right had a complementary, a different style that tended in the same direction. I should say something about Selma James, CLR James's wife. What a very unusual woman. She sometimes, even more than CLR, had this habit of taking a foolish position and really indicating why that position was foolish. When Selma was finished indicating why it was foolish, one had very little doubt about its foolishness. She did, along with CLR, exemplify the power of Marxist thought. That's what one got, a sense that a bourgeois argument could never really stand a chance against a Marxist argument provided one was clear about it. After a while it became self-evident. It became ludicrous to attempt to put forward a bourgeois position. And it was helpful to us to understand that you didn't go into some discussion with them and bring there some high-sounding ideas that you had read by one of the leading bourgeois critics, or even a serious Marxist. You couldn't do that and get away with it in the presence of CLR James and Selma James. End of quote. Well, as ever, studying revolutionary histories, not much changes, but to quote, but generally speaking, the political climate in Britain, especially on the left, was not conducive to the development of any independent Marxist thought. Yes, and that remains the case, and it's very much the case that on the British left, even on the radical left, analysis, a militant anti-colonial, radical socialist analysis of the global situation, the international situation, has always remained a very weak spot on the British left, and that's why people like CLR James, Walter Rodney, Claudia Jones, Manchanda, Shivanandan to a certain extent, all are really important to actually, and there's many others who help to contribute to that kind of chasm and that absence that is there. Of course, Selma James, if one's not mistaken, is still alive today and is still politically active. And you can see the importance here of revolutionary study in collectives and in face-to-face groups here. Also, ideally with those who can guide and mentor and direct the study. I mean, of course, you know, it's there's a few left, but a political giant mind of a historical and ideological understanding, as Walter Rodney is conveying, CLR James is obviously an exceptional figure. Hope that was of some interest. We will continue on this series. I hope you're enjoying it. Please do feedback and share and encourage people to subscribe to our YouTube channel and engage with our work.